equal in worth, dignity, and moral status, and therefore both men and women use their gifts in mutuality and shared authority. So obviously, as an ordained woman, I am part of a church that takes an egalitarian view, that women can be ordained and leaders in ministry in all of its different forms. There are other Christian denominations and obviously other worldviews that are what in Christian circles is called complementarian. Men and women complement each other in their gender roles, and there are certain gender roles for men and for women. And generally speaking, those gender roles are that men have quote unquote authority over women, and therefore women are to quote unquote submit to men. It's why not all Christian denominations ordain women, because they tend to take this complementarian view that it is not basically the role of a woman to lead in church, particularly leading adult men. Maybe teaching Sunday school is okay, maybe being a missionary is okay, but leading in the church in an ordained position is not part of their understanding of the Bible. On that note, both views, of course, would affirm that the Bible supports their position. So egalitarians typically seek to interpret individual biblical passages based on the moral vision of the entire biblical narrative, a contextual interpretation. What's the whole story? How do the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament present God? And I would affirm they present God as love. So that's the big picture view of what's the whole story and how do individual biblical books, biblical passage, biblical verses fit into that narrative of who God is and who we are. Complementarians typically focus on select verses as normative, like this is the verse that we go to and this is what it says, and authoritative for the entire biblical narrative. It's what in Christian circles is called proof texting. You pull a verse or passage out of context and says, well, this is what it says. In some ways known as a more literal interpretation. The Bible says this, it's sort of that bumper sticker, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. There's one interpretation of the Bible, and generally the people who say that, it is their interpretation of the Bible that is authoritative and normative. So moving on, if egalitarians look at the whole biblical narrative, what would a Lutheran Christian say is the moral vision of the Bible? What is the larger narrative? So Christians say that Scripture communicates the gospel of Jesus Christ, the triune God, one God, three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, made, loves, has redeemed, and will restore the world. Love, creative, redeeming, sustaining love. And for Christians, Jesus Christ, the one whom we follow and claim as Savior and Lord, is our interpreter of the Bible. So whatever the Bible says, we look at it through the lens of Christ. What would Jesus do? What did Jesus say? So our vision of Jesus is also how we interpret the Scripture. And what was the moral vision of Jesus? Well, when Jesus was asked about the law, the most important thing, how to live our lives, he said, love God with your whole being and love your neighbor as yourself. So that's the moral vision. Love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. There's love all around for everyone. Agape love, not just sort of feelings of affection, not just sort of familial love or romantic love, but a love that serves and gives to others, as Jesus demonstrated in John 13 in washing the feet of the disciples, a servant love. And I really appreciate Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s definition of agape love, understanding goodwill for all humans. So I believe that is the moral vision of the Bible and of the Christian faith. Of course, at its best, acknowledging that we tragically don't always live into that. But I would argue this is the moral vision of Scripture and of Jesus. So let's look at a few women in the Bible and how they've been presented and how they inform faith and theology. And of course, in the Judeo-Christian tradition here in the West, obviously very informative of our culture as well. So that picture is intentional as a portrayal of Eve, because that is often how Eve is portrayed. So Eve in accounts of the creation and fall. So Eve is mentioned by name 4 times in the Bible. She's not actually mentioned by name in Genesis, in the first book of the Bible, the creation accounts. In Genesis 2 and 3, she's known to be the woman, that is Eve. But she's only named 4 times, twice in Genesis and twice in the New Testament in the writings of the Apostle Paul, who we'll talk about Paul later. There's some challenging things in the writing of Paul when it comes to women in the Bible and women in scripture and church history and polity. So Eve is mentioned 4 times, and one of those times, Eve, the woman, this is Genesis 2. This is the Genesis 2 account of creation. There is, of course, a Genesis 1 account of creation that is very, God creates in order and love, and everything is very, very good. Genesis 2 has a little bit of a different presentation. This is the account in which we get Adam's rib, that God made Adam first. God caused Adam to sleep and took the woman from the rib of the man. The man said, "This is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for from man." And that is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And then the account of the fall. So when the woman saw that the tree was good, its fruit, it's not specified as an apple, but of course in popular tradition, Eve ate the apple, took the tree, desired to make one wise. She took the fruit and ate, gave it to her husband who was with her, and he also ate. Their eyes were open. They knew that they were naked. They sewed fig leaves together. So that is the account of creation and the fall in Genesis 2 and 3. So based on this account, complementarians would argue that Adam was made before Eve, indicating that men have priority over women in the divine order of creation. Men came first, women are secondary. So, and this also seems, and we'll get to Paul, to be affirmed by Paul in his letter to the church in Corinth, 1 Corinthians. Indeed, man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. For this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority over her head because of the angels. As far as I can tell, nobody knows what Paul means when he says because of the angels. It's a mystery of biblical interpretation. However, egalitarians respond, that's a logical deduction based on the scriptural account, that order establishes priority. Just because something comes first, it is better or have priority. So based on this logic, living beings created before humans, which is basically everything else, plants and animals in the creation account, would have priority over them. So if first means authority, then the plants and animals would have authority over humans. It's not really inherent in the scripture itself, it's just a logical deduction. And Paul actually continues, if you read the entire passage, nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, or man independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, the miracle of birth, but all things come from God. So if you actually read Paul's entire statement, he's talking about mutuality. We all come from and depend on each other. Not to be too judgmental, but that sort of literal interpretation often cuts off incomplete thoughts. Because if you go on to what Paul says, you see he's clearly saying, look, we all need each other. And the mutuality in relationship between husband and wife is affirmed in Genesis 2:24. One flesh, one body, in it together, there's a mutuality, an egalitarian relationship, if we want to put it that way, shared authority partnership. And the concluding verse also indicates this passage is a descriptive explanation of marital relationships. That's why. This is Genesis. This is 4,000 years ago or more. This is people sort of trying to figure out why the world works the way it does. And people get married. Well, maybe this is why. We were created that way. It's not a prescriptive, this is how it has to be for all people for all time, directive for the relationship of all men and all women for all time. It's just talking about a marital relationship in that time and in that place. So Eve was created to be Adam's helper, complementarians would argue, indicating that women are subordinate to men. However, the term helper used for woman in Genesis 2:20 is also used in the Old Testament for God as the helper of humans, clearly indicating it is not a term of subservience, because the Hebrew scriptures would never refer to God in a subservient manner. And if you continue on reading Genesis 2:20, a helper as his partner. The Hebrew compound for the word partner is like facing, meaning corresponding, equal and adequate to the man. So again, if you read the verse in full, you see there's more to it than simply a subordinate position. It is a mutual relationship. And finally, complementarians argue that Eve sinned first, indicating that women are more easily deceived into sin and tempt men to sin. And I appreciate the chuckle. Unfortunately, though, I think we're all familiar with that stereotype of Eve. You know, she fell for it. She was not as smart as Adam, and she dragged her husband into it. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but it is certainly a very powerful stereotype in church and social traditions. So, and again, this seems to be affirmed by Paul in 1 Timothy. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but she was. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. Again, a lot of scholars are confused by what Paul actually means here. Egalitarians respond. Genesis 3:6 states that her husband was with her, and he took and ate the fruit. The Genesis account indicates that both men and women are accountable for sin, and that blaming others for our own sin is itself a result of the fall. The woman turns around and blames the snake. The man turns around and blames the woman. Blaming others, i.e. blaming women for the sin of the world, is in and of itself a sin, a result of the fall. We're all accountable for our own actions. In addition, Genesis 3:16 explicitly states the subordination of wives to husbands is a result of the fall. In Christian understanding of the world that is not as God intended it for it to be, it is not part of God's created order. God says to the woman after the fall, yet your desire shall be for your husband and he shall rule over you. The vision that women are subordinate to men is actually part of us that is not as God created us to be, according to the Genesis account itself. And while Paul appears to hold Eve accountable for the fall, he also appears to hold Adam accountable. In 1 Corinthians, for all die in Adam, the specific name Adam, not just the general term for human, so all will be made alive in Christ. So Paul's foundational message is, since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, again, we're all in this together, they are not justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. So again, the moral vision of the Bible is, God said, let us make humankind in our image. So God created humankind in his image. Understanding his image is also, the traditional pronoun for God in the Bible. And in the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Women, equally to men, just like men, are created in the image of God, who Christians do believe is neither male nor female. God is beyond our human limitations and categorizations. So women in the New Testament, of course, talking again, the moral vision of Jesus, love, 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 agape, serving others. And there's a point in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus says to his disciples, you know, among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. That idea that some people subjugate, oppress, rule over others. But it is not so among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. Exactly the opposite idea of hierarchy, patriarchy, any kind of one group of people is to rule over another group of people. This is not the way of Jesus, and he very explicitly says so. So this is Gilbert Belazikian in his book Beyond Sex Roles. Jesus based his definitions of persons and his directives for male-female relations in the creation ideal. As a result, he fearlessly demonstrated in his actions, teachings, and example his rejection of the male leadership principle. So here's some examples. The story of Jesus and the woman in the well in John 4. In the social context of the time, it was unacceptable for men and women to speak with each other in public. This included husbands speaking with their wives. The disciples, the followers of Jesus, were astonished that he was speaking with a woman at the well. It was unacceptable for Jewish people and Samaritan people to interact with each other. They were both from the same familial tribal background, but they had very different understandings about how and where to worship the Lord. And so the Jewish people considered the Samaritan people national enemies and religious heretics. As John writes, Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. So this is not only about gender, it is also about religion, it is also about ethnicity. Jesus is crossing all of these boundaries. So he initiates a public conversation with the Samaritan woman. He has a conversation with her regarding the place and ways in which to worship God through an extensive theological dialogue. He takes her views and questions seriously, and he reveals to her his identity is living water and the Messiah, something he had not shared with a lot of other people by that point. So there's some mutual vulnerability in this conversation. The woman acknowledges that Jesus is a prophet, as the apostle Philip did, invites people to come and see. Many Samaritans come and believe because of her testimony. And according to John, she becomes the first evangelist, speaker, church leader, one might say, to spread the gospel among those outside the Jewish community. One more example, Jesus interacting with Mary Magdalene. So apostle, and this is a big deal in the Christian church about who can be an apostle and how we define apostle. Apostles from a nautical term for sending out, cleared for launch, delegate, envoy, messenger, and predominantly in the New Testament, a group of honored disciples with a special function as God's envoys. So particularly in the New Testament, those who have seen the risen Christ and those who are sent by the crucified and risen Christ to proclaim the good news. So Mary is named for her hometown of Magdala. She traveled with Jesus and the 12 disciples as they proclaimed the good news, along with other women who provided for them out of their resources. So apparently there were a group of women who provided financial resources for the ministry of Jesus. And just to be clear, she is not the sinner or prostitute mentioned in Luke. There was a pope whose name I can't remember, maybe Paula you know, who preached a sermon in the Middle Ages, and he conflated Mary Magdalene, Mary, the sister of Martha, a whole bunch of women named Mary, all as this one person. But that's not Mary Magdalene. And unfortunately, ever since then, that we often see Mary Magdalene portrayed as this sinful woman. Unfair. That's not who she was. So there's this beautiful scene in scripture after the resurrection of Jesus, again, as Christians believe. Mary is the first one there. He calls her name. She recognizes him. He says, "Don't cling to me. I haven't ascended yet." And Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told him that he had said these things to her. So Mary is a prominent figure in all four gospel narratives of Jesus's death and resurrection. She witnesses the crucifixion along with other women who used to follow him and provide for him. In the Synoptic Gospels with other women, she's the first to see the resurrected Christ and tell the other disciples. And in John's account, she's the first person to see the risen Christ Jesus and told by him to be the apostle to the apostles. She is sent to the disciples to tell them about Jesus. So you have Mary Magdalene, you have Paul and Barnabas. Paul refers to Junia as one of the apostles. So there were women apostles in scripture. So we'll end with those sort of hard sayings of Paul that we referred to earlier, the apostle Paul. For a man ought to not have his head veiled, since he is the image We've kind of already referred to this 1 Corinthians about women having head coverings. Women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law says. If there's anything that they desire to know, let them ask their husband at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. And this is a very singular verse in the justification by complementarians for women not speaking in church. Let women be silent with full submission. This is Paul in 1 Timothy. And these are really the only 3 verses in the whole Bible that talk about this. So when we set these in the context of the moral vision of Scripture, it kind of gives it a different meaning. So based on these verses, no women can have a position of authority in the church, especially over adult men. However, Paul's primary concern was the communication of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That was his life mission. Paul was an occasional theologian. Paul was not sitting in an ivory tower thinking through what the faith means. He wrote to a particular group of people in a particular place and time to address particular circumstances. I don't think it was in Paul's mind to presume what was in Paul's mind, though we were going to be reading and discussing his letters centuries later. He was just talking to the moment. And so there are tensions in Paul's writing between the patriarchy of his cultural context and the egalitarianism of the gospel. He seems to affirm both. So Paul appears to contradict himself in addressing the role of women in the church. For example, we already talked about, yes, Paul seems to say, women were created for men, and yet men and women are not independent of each other. Just as women came from man, so man comes through women. Paul's culminating statement is one of equity and mutuality. Women should be silent in the churches. However, in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, any woman who prays or prophesies. Paul addresses how women should speak in church, clearly demonstrating that they were not silent. Praying and prophesying are not silent activities. So Paul says, a woman who prays or prophesies. Any woman who prays or prophesies, prayer is speaking to God on behalf of others. Prophecy is speaking to others on behalf of God. It is by definition a woman speaking in church. With her head unveiled, it's a cultural custom of the time. Again, Paul's main concern is orderly worship with cultural assumptions of social order, what is proper and not. And women should remain silent may actually be Paul quoting what the Corinthians had written to him, and he's actually refuting it. May be the quoted statement of those in the church against whom Paul is arguing. So, when he writes to 1 Timothy, those words in 1 Timothy, he is urging Timothy to stay in Ephesus. The church in Ephesus was plagued by false teachings. And again, Paul is offering descriptive instructions for addressing the crisis in Ephesus, not prescriptive instructions for all churches in all times, for all places. Given their context, women at the time would have been uneducated and untrained, generally speaking. They didn't have the same access to the scriptures and knowledge at the time that men did. And because of this, Paul might say, unqualified to teach or have authority. Thus, Paul instructs them to learn in silence as they continue in faith. Other Pauline passages on the church's teaching ministry do not prohibit women from teaching and encourage all believers to use their gifts for ministry. So again, these are just some singular verses that can be pulled out of context. And finally, there were lots of women in ministry that Paul worked with. So in addition to whatever his letters might say, his letters also talk about a lot of women leaders in the church. He called Phoebe a deacon in the church. Greet Mary, who has worked very hard. Greet Tryphaena and Tryphosa. Greet Julia, Nereus and his sister, and all the saints. And then one final example, I was teaching a class on women in ministry, and I was going to this verse, Colossians 4:15, give my greetings to the brothers and sisters in Laodicea and to Nympha and the church in her house. In the Greek, that's feminine. It's feminine Nympha and her house. So I asked one of the Bible study members to pull down the King James Version and to read this verse or to pull the Bible off the shelf, and it was a King James, and to read this verse. Well, here's the King James translation of that verse. Salute the brethren which are in Laodicea and Nymphas and the church which is in his house. The King James actually changed the feminine Greek into a masculine pronoun because apparently it was not their imagination that a woman could lead a house church. So I was very surprised when I heard that verse read, because I was going under the assumption that that was Nympha and the church in her house. But the King James, so it's an interesting to me when I have sometimes heard people say, well, you can't change the wording of the Bible to include women. And yet here was an example of changing the wording of the Bible to exclude women and literally changing the wording. So, and then of Prisca and Aquila, a partner with Paul, along with her husband in ministry, and accompanied Paul to Ephesus, where they instructed Apollos. And there are just some of the books that I used in my research. So there we go. I guess any questions or comments about, well, thank you. Yeah. Questions or comments about any of that? And I know we'll have some discussion time later too.
Well, besides that being wonderful, and
well,
I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Lauren, is it Lauren?
Yes, it is. Hi, I also enjoyed it, Jennifer. Thank you very much. And my question is whether or not there's been any study that you're aware of about the extent to which all of the different translations, and not even translations, but even the hand copying of the Bible by monks for, I don't know, over 1,000 years or something like that, might have influenced the ways in which earlier scriptures may have been changed to reflect more of the patriarchy of the time.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in my experience, that Nympha is sort of a singular example. And that's why, the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls was so significant. I don't think it was the scriptures themselves necessarily that were altered. I think from a Christian perspective, we have what we need, and it's faithful and trustworthy to come to faith. But of course, they were influenced by the patriarchal culture. I mean, the writing itself, it's God inspired, but it's written by people who were people of their times. And so, of course, in that way, it was deeply influenced by, Paul was a man of his time, and he was not immune to the cultural understandings of his time. So that's the role of biblical interpretation.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say that redaction criticism is a study that's been done about the ways that biblical verses have been changed? And I know that Junia, the apostle, at one time, her name was masculinized.
Julius.
Yeah, I couldn't remember what it was, but so there's another example like Nympha of somebody deciding, some redactor deciding that it couldn't have been a woman.
But wonderfully, we now they've been able to go back to those original sources and sort of recover what was redacted, and that's how we know there was redaction. So yeah. Any other? Stephen, yeah.
Well, I have to tell you, I loved your presentation.
Oh, thanks.
Fantastic. A couple of thoughts. One is, since I come from an LDS background, I really loved your comparison of the complementarian versus egalitarian. But I would say that from the LDS perspective, they are really almost the same, because you got to take out the submit part of the complementarian. And I will tell you that my mother was an educator who was left-handed and wound up teaching penmanship, and they wouldn't let her teach it because she was left-handed. So, I've grown up with the many of the issues that you described along the way. And fortunately, I will have to say that I am incredibly thankful for my mother, who taught me that women are really in the egalitarian mode. So I just can't thank you enough for what you showed.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
I appreciated your presentation very much too, as an overview of, you know, what our thinking is, and most of the assumed thinking that is brought to the you know, current level of contextual understandings. I was pleased to learn a few years ago about a concept called interpolation theory.
Mm.
And interpolation theory says, among biblical scholars, that the later, after Paul died, after 64, the school of the church, we must remember that the primitive Christian church was not one happy family. And that most of, if you really read Paul's letters, they are written as a lawyer would write, and we're reading the defense, not the prosecution. And that is because Paul was a lawyer and he brought that. So we're actually reading one side of the story. He is responding to accusations that are coming at him from the Jerusalem church, because they have started to renege on the agreement that he got the franchise for the Gentiles and they would keep the franchise for the Jews in Jerusalem. And so they were concerned that he was blowing off religious requirements like the calendar, the diet, letting women run things, and all of that, when those things were forbidden among the Jerusalem church. So when Paul died, they went back into his writings and started inserting things, and that's where women should stay silent in church got put in. That was actually after Paul. And if you did a very good job of presenting all these wonderful things, and here's just this one thing. And what I was taught in school a few years ago was go with what all the wonderful things are saying, because most likely that one or two things is somebody fiddling with it. And so you are able to actually make that kind of literary distinction. The other thing was a little bit about, you know, the undisputed letters of Paul. You know, I can't spiel them off right off the top of my head, but Timothy is not one of the undisputed letters of Paul. Timothy is a disputed letter. So that could mean that the Timothy reference is outside the context of Paul. Because the purpose of the course that I saw was actually to show that I took as a part of my studies was, I didn't know this was the purpose, but it was the purpose when it was over, was to show that Paul actually was going toward inclusion in the church. And that based upon the work of Augustine or Augustine or whatever you want to, you know, however you want to say that, I don't know how to say it. Based upon that work, the church has been screwed up ever since. And that if we would stick with the Paul who was the guy trying to get the Greeks accepted as Christians, that we would be doing a whole lot better in the inclusion department. So that was, if you start reading like 1 Corinthians, the other thing is 2 Corinthians is all messed up, but it was actually written in a different order than the chapters that we have. We don't have the right chapter order, chapter and verse order. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that got put back together in a bad way. And you can tell that when like sentences end and something else totally comes into it. But in 1 Corinthians, Galatians is primary, probably the first one. These are arguments back. It's a fight with the Jerusalem church. And it's done in the style of first century Greek legal practices.
Yeah.
When somebody made their case against, somebody made their case for, and a judgment was rendered on the same day. That's how. So the overview is really true, is really there. And if we want to take what you presented, and I appreciate that very much, I just wanted to offer it can go further. And this concept that, quite frankly, I was 60 some years old when I was there, a confirmed kid, Methodist kid, you know, went to seminary, did all this stuff, and I had never heard of interpolation theory until about 3 years ago. So, and that completely opened up my understanding of Paul, and to be honest, made me switch to being a Paul fan when I realized that he's been poorly dealt with through the centuries. That's it. Thanks.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. Thank you.
Okay, I think next we should have Yasuyo. Have I said that right? Because mine is also from a Christian perspective, and I'd really like to hear what she has to say. So, Michael, are you there?
Just give her 1 second.
Okie doke. That way, because I don't want us to run out of time and miss hearing what she has to say.
While we're waiting, one thing that interested me in a quirky sort of way, Jennifer, is the reference to contextual, and the opposite of that, rather than looking at the whole thing in its context, is textualism. And we see that as a major divide today on our Supreme Court. Those who zero in on one phrase or sentence of the Constitution, and that is a literal interpretation. It's not tied into anything else. So I wonder where that textual comes from. Maybe perhaps the church dispute.
There are a lot of similarities there. I hear that. And of course, I think of Jesus saying, you have missed the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith, you know, and so, yeah, it's a challenge. I think you can take the Bible seriously, but not necessarily always literally. And I think there's a big difference. And I think sometimes taking the Bible seriously means not taking it literally, as that's understood. Yeah. Great point. Thank you.
I just had a quick one.
Yeah, I was going to say, while we were waiting, did you? Yeah.
I saw, I think I saw a flash on the screen, a picture of the tomb, but it was in a garden. I was actually in the old city of Jerusalem many years, in the 90s, and the tomb was actually in the old city itself. I just thought I'd ask.
Yeah, so there are two. It's a little bit like George Washington's left here. There are a couple places that claim so the one that has the best claim is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is probably where you were. And that's got a pretty good claim for being the place of the death and resurrection of Jesus. But there's a place called the Garden Tomb that also claims that, and it's a beautiful spot. So that's why it's called the Garden Tomb. It probably is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but it's just a gorgeous experience to be there. So that photo is from that spot.
The Garden Tomb.
The Garden Tomb. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
While we're waiting, can we have a motion to accept the minutes of the last meeting, the 2/2/21 meeting?
So moved.
We have a second?
Second,
So we are accepting the minutes of the last meeting. Okay, Michael, do you want to give your treasurer's report while we're waiting?
I can. Let's see. Okay, so we're doing pretty well here. Our most recent member is LDS. Stephen Parkin and Susan are the voting members. So we have what, some 22 people, 21 people who can vote now. Great. Here's the rest of the budget. So you can see we're doing really well. Almost at our total budget for the fiscal year. Okay.
Okay, maybe we should do our vote on the logo then, and we will have done a good job in the business part of the meeting. So does everybody have the different logo designs?
Yeah, I just put it in the, you have here, I'll put it up.
The logo design was distributed with the first announcement of today's meeting.
Yes.
Yeah, and I put it in the chat too. So it's all okay.
Okay.
And you got 1, 2, 3.
So we have the design with the logo with the name of the council underneath, and we have the logo with the name of the council to decide. So let's, how should we do this? Raise our hand? I don't know if I can count and see everybody.
Well,
Maybe we should put it in the chat.
yeah, good idea.
So vote for either underneath or beside. Let's call underneath 1 and beside 2, and then vote for either 1 or 2.
Could I just throw something into the discussion first?
Of course.
I think either way we go, the italic face is not complementary to the initials, the symbol. And I would ask us to consider having the name in a regular typeface that is complementary to the symbol
I see what you're saying.
that the graphic designer put together. The italic just creates kind of a disconnect in my mind.
Well, and another option is we can just vote for the symbol, and then there's flexibility in how we want to later use the, and then later we can, change the text or just use the text as we need to. That's another option.
I think that's a great idea, Jennifer.
Yeah, we just approve the symbol, which the symbol's the same.
Yeah.
So if we just approve the symbol, we can figure out the text as we go.
Yeah.
it's a striking logo.
Um,
And the name is not as important as the information portrayed in the connection and the logo.
Can I just offer that in my understanding from visual impairment, that italic is difficult for people with macular degeneration to read, and that actually that italic is a good thing to avoid in common policies. Secondly, I did spend 11 years working for a graphic design company, I think this is a really good logo, like Stephen says. I would offer that it appears to me that the D and the C are the same as the typeface if the typeface was not italic. And so my via media is to unitalic the typeface, and I bet it'll, and I think, I should say it that way, I think it would appear complementary. I'm not sure it would be egalitarian, but I think it would be complementarian to the to the logo itself. That D and that C look very similar if they weren't italicized.
Yeah.
Well, and then another thing to make them perhaps a bit, the symbol and the type perhaps a little bit more complementary still would be to bold the type, since the symbol seems to be bold.
Yeah. May I offer a motion?
Please.
That we adopt the symbol as presented, and that the placement of the name of the organization be given back to the designer, however, that it not be in italic font.
Second.
All those in favor? Looking and I forgot to vote myself. Okay, so that's what we will, I'm thinking everybody voted aye.
Yeah.
I think, yes, that's what I got.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just offer one more thing? Sometimes with logos, you actually can let the name of the organization, you can have more than one application.
Yeah.
So if it was at the top of a letterhead, maybe you would want the type underneath it. If it was in a column or something, maybe you would want the type stacked. So it's also possible that you could say, let the, apply the type once you get a desire, your desired font. So either stacked or underneath is appropriate to the application.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the designer could allow that.
Yeah.
So that's all.
I'll get with Nick, and I don't know that it would take him too much time to just go without italics. But failing that, but to your point, I mean, a letterhead and a website, you're going to have different. Yeah. It's a different situation anyway. So I think we've got the symbol now. We can move forward with that.
Yeah, great.
All right, we're going to run out of time. So Yasuyo, can you begin your part of the presentation? And it's nice to meet you, by the way, even though it's not in person.
Nice to meet you, everyone. I'm Yasuyo from Japan. I want to share my Buddhism. First of all, I want to share the Buddha's saying, monks and wise men, just as a goldsmith would test his gold by burning, cutting, and loving it, so must you examine my words and accept them, not merely out of reverence for me. My teaching is not philosophy, it is the result of direct experience. My teaching is means of practice, not something to hold on to or worship. My teaching is like a raft used to cross the river. These are the words that Buddha is said to have spoken. It is said that he did not feel that he was practicing the religion. He just wanted to share his enlightenment with as many people as he could, and he changed the way he communicated depending on the individual. So I believe that the only way to interpret his words is for us to analyze research and experience them for ourselves. So I hope you will take my Buddhism as my own personal matter. My belief is that I let myself be what I am without adhesion to change, and I believe my actions in my life are what I deserve to believe. So the first, I would like to share about my experience that change should not be feared or obsessed with. When I was 18 years old, my parents divorced, and I felt my foundation is broken. My foundation means my base was my family. And I noticed I have nothing to believe because my foundation is broken. So I starting to understand Buddhism that everything is change. Nothing is stay as they are. So how can I don't like changing. So I'm worried about my life. So so in Buddhism, we can't change. Change should not be feared or obsessed with. So I try to consider myself in the changing, and I accept changing is very positive thing. And next one, when I want to share about my belief is my action in my life are what I deserve to believe. When I was 17 years old, I saw the documentary of Mother Teresa. My pronunciation is okay, Mother Teresa.
Yeah, Mother Teresa.
Mother Teresa.
Yeah.
And while she had the strength to fight the incomprehension of many of her people, it means because of her religion, her country religion, India, the died people considered untouchable people. But she tried to save them, take care of them. So people asked she is not a good person because died people is untouchable people. But she tried to give died people one spoonful of water. And the last died people is very glad. No one is take care of themselves, but Mother Teresa gave them water. I thought it's very easy to give people one spoon of water. So I decided to be nurse. But now I understood it is very hard to give people to one spoon of water now, but I want to try. And I believe my action is I can believe myself. So in conclusion, my belief is that I let myself be what I am without adhesion of change, and I believe my action in my life are what I deserve to believe. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much. We're a bit past our time. Does anybody have any questions?
Just really quick, I wanted to thank you, and I I was taken with what you said about Buddhism, if I understood, not like a religion, but a practice, like how we live our life. Is that, and that's kind of what I understood. Is that a fair? It's more about how we live, our actions and our.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. Okay.
How you live.
Yes. How
How
we
you
live.
live.
How we live. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Yasuyo, I want to thank you for being part of this today. I really appreciate the new insights that you have brought to this group. Thank you.
Thank you to saying that.
And I want to thank you, Yasuya. It was wonderful to hear you talk about change as being something that's just always with us. And I sort of applied that to what we were saying earlier about being contextual or being a textualist in the Bible. And secondly, I wanted to thank you very much for speaking to us in English, because if I had to give that presentation in Japanese, we'd have been in a lot of trouble. So thank you.
Thank you. My English is improving, but not perfect. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I think since
Yes.
we're past our time, I'm not going to give
Paula,
my.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think Susan was trying to jump in
Oh,
there.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer. I just wanted to ask Yasuyo, did your last statement say, my actions are what I believe?
Yes.
I got that right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So I want to do something good things.
Thank you.
Paula, you can give your talk. I mean, it's recording, so.
Yeah, I would like to hear you, Paula. I'm not going anywhere myself.
I'd like to stay also. I'd like
Me
to
too.
stay.
Okay, I just didn't want to keep a meeting going where people were feeling uncomfortable and needing to leave. Oh, okay. So unless there's anything else, I'll just get started with this. Okay. First, I want to say that in this, this is just a simple reading of the texts like most people read them. There's no form criticism. There's one little piece of redaction criticism. There's no historical criticism. It's just a simple reading of the text. And I'll give you a tiny bit of my background, how I came to feminist theology. So I can still remember where I was standing in the vestibule of CV Christian Church. It was Women's Sunday, probably Mother's Day, which is the day that the women not only get to prepare the communion and clean up the communion, they also get to walk solemnly up the aisle and say the prayer and distribute the communion. And I remember thinking, God's a man, Jesus is a man, the minister's a man, the deacons are men, the ushers are men. Where are the women? And why are the only women I am taught about either prostitutes, virgins, or mothers? And that's where the title of my book came from. I used to think, where are the women? Didn't they do anything else? And that was also the Sunday that we had an insert in our brochure. And instead of singing, "This is my father's world," we sang, "This is my mother's world." I guess they didn't think we could change the father to mother without reading it in the bulletin. Shortly after I had that experience, in 1971, I went to a church camp in Los Angeles that was designed to get rural kids, and then this was really rural, into the city to experience what city life was like. We picketed with farm workers who were picketing a packing shed. We went to MacArthur Park to see how the homeless lived. We went to African American Disciples of Christ Church and talked to kids our age about their experience with racism. But the encounter that had the most impact on me was when we went to the Feminist Women's Health Center and had a tour. And then we went back to the church in which we were staying and brought one of the women with us. And I don't remember what she said. I remember her hair was flowing and her shawl was flowing and her skirt was flowing. And she talked to us about feminism. When she had finished, the boys went into one room with the male counselors to talk, and the girls stayed with her, sitting at her feet like disciples. And when the time to come back together came, the girls felt like the time apart had been too short, and the boys felt like the time apart had been too long. And I was changed. I realized that other women questioned the teachings about women and questioned their lack of representation. I like to say that Sunday school was my favorite subject, and my Sunday school teachers used to tell my mother, she always asks the hard questions. My BA is in religion and my MA is in religion, and I can guarantee that neither one of those programs were taught from a feminist perspective. They didn't even have a class, either one of them, about women in religion. So in 1995, I was in search of a PhD program, and I went to Pacific School of Religion, Heaven on Earth, and took a class from feminist lesbian Christian Virginia Remy Melancott. Kevin, I think you know her. I took a class from Catholic feminist theologian, Dr. Sister Miriam Teresa Winter. And I took a class from Jewish feminist theologian, Joe Milgram. I gave up my search for a PhD program, and instead I enrolled in a Doctor of Ministry in International Feminist Theology program at San Francisco Theological University. So what is feminist theology? And there are probably as many answers to that as there are feminist theologians. So I will demonstrate feminist theology by looking at the story of the Exodus. When feminists read biblical stories, we don't just read about God and the guys. We look for the women in the stories and we look for their actions. So in Exodus 1, 15 through 22, we notice the story of the midwives who courageously lie to the face of the king to save baby boys. We also notice that they're named. Of the 1,426 people who are named in the Hebrew scriptures, 111 of them are women. So these two midwives who are named must have been very important to the community. We also notice 3 other women who heroically defied the king and saved a particular baby boy. We notice his mother, we notice his sister, and we notice his adoptive mother. And 2 of those 3 women are named. The sister is named later in the book of Exodus, and his mother is named in the book of Numbers. In much the same way that Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat sparked the civil rights movement, the actions of these women sparked the Exodus. As Dr. Sister Miriam Teresa Winter writes, if I can find her quote, they became the saviors of the savior of their people. In Exodus 2, 16 through 17, 7 women are harassed by shepherds as they are trying to water their father's sheep. Moses comes to their rescue. As a result, Zipporah, one of the women, is given to Moses for wife. Except for her decisive and dramatic actions, which save Moses's life, we notice that she is either being taken, given, brought, or sent by her father or her husband. And if you will excuse me just a moment, I need to take a sip of water because, like I said in the beginning, I think I've forgotten how to talk. Miriam, the sister of Moses and Aaron, reappears in Exodus 15, 20 through 21. Unlike her first appearance in the scripture, she is named and called a prophet. She leads the women in celebration of their escape from Pharaoh. In Numbers 12, both Miriam and Aaron criticize Moses, but God punishes Miriam, not Aaron. Feminists ask, why is Miriam punished and not Aaron? And this is where the little bit of redaction criticism comes in. Was it an attempt by a later redactor to put a woman with too much power in her place? The text says the people refused to leave until Miriam was brought back into the camp. Finally, the prophet Micah says, quotes God as saying, I set before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Jewish feminist theologian Judith Plaskow addresses another important feminist observation of the story of Exodus. She says in her book, Standing Again at Sinai, Judaism from the Feminist Perspective, entry into the covenant at Sinai is the root experience of Judaism, the central event that establishes the Jewish people. Given the importance of this event, there can be no verse in Torah more disturbing to the feminist than Moses warning the people, be ready on the third day, do not go near a woman. For here, at the very moment that the Jewish people stand at Sinai, ready to receive the covenant, Moses addresses the community only of men. She points out that the issue is ritual impurity, but Moses does not instruct men and women not to go near each other. At the central moment of Jewish history, women are invisible. Feminists look at stories of biblical women we are taught about and women we are not taught about. Some of the stories we are taught about have been maliciously misinterpreted, like Mary being a prostitute. The story of the Levites' concubine is one of those stories we are rarely taught about. It is an horrific story. And like the story of Lot's nameless wife, it is used as a cautionary tale to women and girls. The story of the Levites' concubine appears in Judges 19, 1 through 30, and goes something like this. The Levite took a young woman. Jennifer, you're shaking your head. The Levite took a young woman to be his concubine, and she was unhappy in the relationship, so she fled back to her father's house. 4 months later, the Levite decides to go get her and speak kindly to her. I think it's interesting, feminists think it's interesting that that would be something the biblical writer would need to say. When he gets to her father's house, the father and the Levite eat, drink, and be merry for 4 or 5 days and finally leave. On the way home with the concubine, they stop in Gibeah and stay at the house of an old man. Like in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the townsmen come to the door and want the male visitors to come out and have sex with them. Unlike the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, there are no angels in the house to protect the concubine like there were angels in Lot's house to protect his daughters. So the concubine is thrown out and gang raped all night. In the morning, the Levite comes out, fed and rested, and says to her, get up, because she's lying on the ground at the door, we're leaving. When she does not get up, he throws her over his horse and takes her home, where he cuts her into 12 pieces and distributes the pieces to the men of Israel to show the wrong that has been done to him. The only time I ever heard this story taught in church, the minister ended it by saying, see what can happen if you don't obey your father or your husband? In the same way, Lot's nameless wife, I like to call her Lottie, has been used to caution women and girls to obedience. When South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford apologized to his cabinet for his extramarital affair, he compared himself to King David, who gave in to the temptress Bathsheba. When feminists look at Bathsheba's story, we don't see any tempting going on. David was a voyeur who spied on Bathsheba while she performed her ritual cleansing after her menstrual cycle. He found out who her father was, and he didn't care. He found out who her husband was, and he didn't care. He sent men to her home to get her, bring them to him, bring her to him, had sex with her, and sent her away. It is the age-old story of a powerful man taking what he wants from a powerless woman. When feminists look at this story, we see rape rather than seduction. When Bathsheba told the king she was pregnant, he called her husband home from the front lines. He wanted the husband to go sleep with her so that the baby would look like his. But her husband, Uriah, was an honorable man who had been consecrated for war, so he did not go home. When he did not go home, the king sent him back to the front line with a note that would guarantee his death. I want to mention two Christian women. One is Mary, the mother of Jesus, and one is Mary Magdalene, which Jennifer's already done a beautiful job of covering. The patriarchal story of Mary Magdalene is one of those stories that has been maliciously misinterpreted. The scripture says that 7 demons went out of Mary, not that she was a prostitute. Of all of the men who had demons driven out of them, not one of them has anything to do with prostitution or sexuality, even the demonic that was running around naked. There would be no Easter morning without the profession of Mary and the other women of the empty tomb. Christians believe that salvation came into the world through the broken and bleeding body of Jesus. Feminists would add that salvation came into the world first through the broken and bleeding body of Mary in childbirth. Finally, in Christian scriptures, only angels and women serve or minister to Jesus. The problem is the translation of the word diakonia. When it is translated for women, it is translated serve. When it is translated for angels, it is translated minister. So if we translate the word minister in relation to Peter's mother-in-law, we discover that when she was healed, she got up and ministered to them. A very different reading than, much like the King James reading that you mentioned earlier of the translation that misrepresents what was really going on. So that is a brief overview of the way feminists look at, I'm glad to see you nodding, Jennifer, the way feminists look at the scriptures to the way they have been traditionally interpreted to us. The end. Thank you.
Wow. Wow.
Paula, if I can ask, yeah, and I thank you so much. Particularly with those really challenging, yeah, I knew what was coming. So I was challenging, shaking my head, those challenging Old Testament stories. I do wonder, given the moral, and I'm not as familiar with this, from a feminist perspective, I mean, given the moral vision of scripture and the kind of the overall picture, I mean, how is that contextualized? Why is that included in the biblical narrative? And would they say that's just to honor the woman who suffered, to tell her story? I just kind of, where's the meaning found in that? Or is it just a text of terror? I think is Phyllis
Tribble, right?
Phyllis Tribble, yeah, a text of terror, that it's kind of a critique on the society itself.
Because the Bible is written by men for men, and the value of especially the concubine, not the wife, is minuscule. And because he cut her up and sent her to show the wrong that had been done to him, I think in the context of the biblical writing, it would have been seen as, look what they did to him. And then from our perspective, we see it as horrific, but I don't think it would have had the same impact as what was done to the woman, as what was done to this Levite, who's this holy man of God. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think in the cultural context, but then if I understand that text of terror, it's that in and of itself is, so the horrific nature of it is actually a biblical critique, like including the story that we reflect on is an actual critique of that behavior. So the society itself would have accepted it, but from a biblical moral vision, it's there to present how terrible that is and how this is not how things should be, I guess is kind of what I was, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I hadn't thought about it that way, but.
Yeah, I think it as a critique of it, telling that story to show this is not how things should be. This is not how we should behave.
Not good behavior.
No.
Paula, hi. Thank you for that presentation. It was phenomenal. So I have two quick questions. One is, can you give me the chapter and verse of that horrible
Yeah.
Pieces? What was that chapter and verse again, if you don't mind?
Judges 19, 1 through 30.
19, 1 through 30. Thank you. And then my second question is, years ago when I was in my 20s, maybe my 30s, I read a book called The Feminist Attack on the Bible. I don't know if you've seen that, or you may have. I'd be happy to send you the information on it. You can look it up, I'm sure. But at any rate, it was at that point that I really realized much more fully than I had in the past, just how many misogynist passages there are in the Bible. And so my question to you is, given that that's the case, in your experience as one feminist scholar, feminist biblical scholar perhaps, do you think it's true that for many feminist women, or what young women today might call woke women, they just say, look, this is not a book I can have any faith in, because it's just, there's too much overall violence and certainly too much misogyny. So the Bible just doesn't work for me. Do you, in your experience, is that the case for many feminist women or young women or woke women, or not? Do they try to parcel it out?
Well, of course, it's a spectrum. There are a lot of women who are biblical scholars and teach in seminaries and universities who don't practice a faith, I'll say, or at least don't practice a biblical faith, and they approach it from a purely intellectual, historical perspective. And a young woman that I'm very good friends with recently we wrote together an article for the Christian Feminism Today website, and we addressed that because she doesn't consider herself religious, but she was willing to be in conversation with me about that. I don't have a choice. I'm just a dyed in the wool Christian, and that's, you know, I couldn't walk away from that any more than I could walk away from my head. So there is, of course, a spectrum of people who read the misogyny in there and just can't deal with it. But I feel like I have to deal with it.
Thank you.
Can I just add?
Please.
As you know, as a pastor and again as a kind of but you know, for every concubine there is a Deborah who was a judge of Israel. You know, there's a Ruth, there's an Esther. For every misrepresentation of Mary Magdalene, there's people who are out there telling what a significant part of the story of Jesus she was. So I understand, yeah, there's a lot of violence and misogyny and sin, what we would call sin in the Bible, because it's a retelling of human experience. To me, that makes it real. People do behave in these ways, unfortunately, but you know, to me, looking at Christ and his example, clearly that falls short of what God intends for us. And because the Bible includes it, is an indication that it's a real documentation of human history, but it's a redemptive story, I would argue, ultimately. That there is a Deborah for every Lot's wife, you know, there. And so I, you know, I just sort of playing the role of apologist. I tend to look at the overall, the good that's there in the midst of the bad, not to acknowledge the bad's not there.
That's one of the things I love about listening to you, Jennifer, is you always bring, just like with your presentation, both sides of the story, both sides of the argument. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
I just want to thank you, Paula, for organizing today's panel. It's been a real eye-opener for me on many different levels, and I want to thank each of you who presented. You all did a fantastic job.
Thank you, John. I want to thank everybody for being here, and I want to thank Jennifer and I'm so afraid I'm going to mess up your name. I have to read it so I don't mess it up. Yasuyo, for being willing to present. I think we conducted all of our business. So are we ready for the blessing? Okay.
Just before then, I would like to remind people that the next meeting, which is on April 9th, we will be considering an amendment to our bylaws. Each of you should have received the amendment. I sent it out about 3 days ago or so, because we have to provide a 30-day notice. It has to be read and considered by all of us before we vote on it in April.
And John, I hope you don't mind. I'd just like to say really quickly that on Tuesday, the 16th at 6 o'clock, the Stonewall Democrats of the Desert is having a Women's History Month presentation, and I'll be one of the panels.
Oh, cool.
When is that again?
It's Tuesday, March 16th. It's at 6. It's online. So just Google Stonewall Democrats of the Desert, and you should be able to get the link. Thank you.
Anything else? Yasuyo, would you like to offer the blessing?
Is it okay for Buddhism?
Yes.
Ah, very short one.
Hmm.
Oh, Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. It's only 3 times. Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. Thank you.
Thank you. All righty. Unless anybody has something else, I think we're saying goodbye.
Wonderful panel. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Invite me.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.